I'm Vince, also known as PleasantKenobi on the internet, and yes, I need a haircut. I've got one booked for tomorrow, so the next video you see of me that isn't a stream video from several weeks ago, I will have much nicer hair. Less hair, but nicer. Anyway, let's talk about the reserve list. The reserve list is a hot button topic right now. I think this they come up to the forefront of the Magic conversation, the discourse, if you will, when cards started spiking at the beginning of lockdown, where people were getting their stimulus checks in America and buying stuff, and then other people started buying shit out, as they always do. I tweeted about Gaia's Cradle having an enormous spike due to probably a single weird sale, and people got on my back saying I'm the one encouraging people to panic buy and other such fucking nonsense. And then this has led on to the conversation being reignited. The professor has done a video called "The Reserve List is a Lie," which I do agree with the majority of what he's saying in that video. However, I'm going to talk today about how the reserve list is never going away, and there's just one clear, kind of obvious to me reason, and it might shock you. You won't believe number 5, but yeah, I'm going to talk about my reasons for why I don't think the reserve list is going anywhere. Just to fill people in who don't know what the fuck the reserve list is, it is 572 cards, a list of very old cards from some of the earlier sets of Magic. It's filled with legacy, vintage and commander staples that would help players massively if they were reprinted. The list itself is designed to instill confidence, or was designed, should I say, to instill confidence into collectors, and not explicitly but also investors, in order to keep them in the game and encourage others to do the same. This promise, which is not a contract that anyone has signed, but it is a promise, is supposedly legally binding, similar to a contract, through a thing called promissory. I fucking fucked that up. Promissory estoppel. Frustrating thing is that because there's a load of old cards on this reserve list that were promised to never be reprinted in order to keep collectors in the game back in like 1994 or whatever it was. Because of that, a lot of the dual lands that I needed for formats that I love, like Legacy, are never getting reprinted, which means the accessibility of those formats gets worse and worse every year as more and more of them go into trade binders, they get graded and disappear, they get destroyed, and basically, on a long enough timeline, these formats cannot survive in non-digital spaces because the cards will be gone, or not accessible, because the prices go up, because they spike and get bought out. Yeah. So it keeps the price of Eternal Staples high, it keeps the confidence in the underpinning collector's market of Magic from its first 3 or 4 sets also quite high, whilst also damaging the accessibility of the game. It has its pros, it has its cons. For the most part, I am on the side of things where I think the reserve list was a fucking mistake. Saf and Olive recently wrote about how it's not necessarily a mistake at the time, it's only a mistake with hindsight, because Magic was young when this happened. This was when Chronicles was threatening to reprint things into the ground and damage the collective market of Magic, and Magic was only a couple of years old. So to keep the confidence in Magic and keep Magic alive, they resorted to something like the reserve list. And I get where he's coming from. Magic won't even exist in the way it does now. It may never have lived out those first few years if something like this didn't happen, to keep people from, selling the cards, investing in the cards, to sell them as vendors and so on. So I get where he's coming from, but with hindsight, it is now a damaging problem for the game. So, let's talk very briefly about the controversy around the reserve list, or the conversation around the reserve list, before I come to my clear reason why it's never going anywhere. There are some objective facts about this that you cannot refute, and there are some things that are open for discussion, which is the ongoing eternal debate. And I know a couple of people are going to see the thumbnails for this, probably not engage with this video, and bitch and moan about me in their own little group chats and their own private Twitters saying, oh, he's just doing it for the clout! But this conversation, I think, is interesting because it keeps coming up on my Discord, it keeps coming up and people want to talk about it. But I'm starting to come to a very clear set viewpoint myself. I hate the fucking reserve list, but I know it's never going to go anywhere for the reasons I'm coming to. But the facts. Let's talk about the facts real quick. Objectively, there are people at Wizards of the Coast who feel the reserve list was a mistake, and they wish it never happened. For example, this isn't exactly his words that I just said, but Mark Rosewater has said he can't change the reserve list if only people knew how hard he's tried to do it in the past. The next bit of objective fact is just how much the collective reserve list cards in this world cost. Collectively, they're valued at, should I say. Not cost, but are valued at. According to Chaz Andres in a Star City Games article, there is 1,100 copies of any given rare in Alpha. So let's take Underground Sea here, for example. That makes that total number of Alpha Underground Seas, well, let's take 40% have been destroyed, let's say, lost over time, stuck in bike spokes when they thought Underground Seas weren't good, to make brrr noises on their bikes, I don't fucking know. Let's say 40% have gone. Lost to time. Probably too high an amount, but who knows. That alone values the remaining 60% at $2.4 million under its current TCG average price. That's just alpha, and that's just 60% of the Underground Seas. MKM approximates that there are 25,000 copies of any unlimited rare. This is the 3rd edition set. So we've had alpha and beta, now on to 3rd edition. Underground Sea is approximately $844.86. It's not even approximate, so I'm just grabbing the TCG average again. That's $21.1 million worth of Underground Seas. Going with, let's say, only 40% exist, 60% were destroyed for some reason, you know, lost, destroyed, stuck up people's asses, that sort of thing. That's still 8.4 million. That is only a fraction of the Underground Seas, and that's only talking about Alpha and Unlimited, and we're already at $10 million just for those. And let's have one last example. Revised. This is the 4th edition. MKM says there's 300,000 copies of revised rares. So at $650 each, that's just shy of 200 million. I don't think I have to labour this point anymore. There is a lot of money in the reserve list collections that exist around the world, especially when you start to combine them amongst collectors, investors, vendors, stores and traders. It's quite easy to say there are hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars invested in Underground Seas, Moxen, Power 9 and other shit like Drops of Honey and Moats and crap like that that's on the reserve list. That is a irrefutable fact. So then, this is where we get away from facts now. We start to extrapolate a little bit. It's quite obvious, it's quite clear and easy to understand why investors, stores, collectors and vendors and such might see a problem with having that stock or that lump of costly cards reduced in value if, this is where the contention comes in, if that were to happen with the reprinting of new cards. But where I'm going with this is, there's a lot of points to discuss that are ifs. So, for example, if new cards were printed, the old ones would fall in price. There are arguments looking at Birds of Paradise and Shift and Dragon, as the Professor has done, and I have spoken about on this channel before in the past as well. Those cards, the original alphas and betas, are worth quite a bit of money, even though Shift and Dragon itself is basically a free card given away in starter intro decks by Wizards of the Coast to stores to give to people for free. The new versions. There is a historic precedent for that, but but people do say that that's not a good comparison to the actual reserve list, because the actual reserve list is different, because there aren't new printings of it and the cards aren't played in newer formats and yada yada yada. It's not a one-for-one comparison. Again, this is where we start to have the debate, right? And there's also conversations around whether or not, once the reserve list is gone, if that damages the integrity of the market enough, the gold standard that exists behind Magic, that people start to sell out, flood the market, supply and demand goes fucking wild, economics, capitalism, oh my god, cards are worth less money. There's a lot of debate and discussion to be had around this. Some things that you might take for granted and think are just like true, like the reserve list is bad. Some people will argue against that. I've had this happen in a call on my Discord over the weekend where people were arguing back and forth about their own collections and things like that. It's interesting that so much of it is up in the air, but the undebatables are, some people at WotC don't like it, some people in the community don't like it, and there are millions, if not billions of dollars worth of these cards floating around in collections around the world. So, another contentious point is whether or not they could take this to court. Whether or not through promissory estoppel, the idea that a promise can be seen as a contract in a court of law, and if that contract is broken, people can be held responsible for the damages that come from the breach of said contract. That idea has been floating around since I started getting into Magic in any capacity beyond just playing on the kitchen tabletop. I've heard this a lot. The reserve list is legally binding and they would get sued the shit out of. However, that's not objective fact. Some people are going to sit there in the comment sections and get angry now at me watching this video saying it is fact. But there are a lot of back and forth on this as well. For example, who and how many people could get together to create a class action lawsuit. Those things are not easy to bring about. Class action lawsuits also, if you look at them, their reasons for existing tend to be much more serious shit than this. I did a bit quick Google, and you can too. Just look at the Wikipedia page for the most well-known examples of those sort of court cases, and the things like fucking racial discrimination stuff, not the breaching of a verbal or written promise. Yeah, they don't quite line up. Also, class action lawsuits are very, very expensive, so that's another problem. Would people be able to get enough money together, not knowing necessarily that they would win this court case? Then we've got people like Scott Piazza, who's an attorney with a keen interest in contract law, to quote himself, who wrote for MTG Goldfish about the reserve list in the past, and spoke about breaking down what a contract is, and whether or not promises can be contracts, and all this sort of stuff as well. Again, this is just one attorney, and obviously that's the whole point of law. People will argue over this shit. Would it ever get to a court of law? Would it get thrown out of a court of law? Would it count as promissory estoppel? Does the promise count? Yada, yada, yada. There's so many questions that aren't definitive set things. However, something I can say quite definitively, and I guess arguably this is a contentious point, but quite definitively, if people lost millions of dollars, if collectively a group of people lost billions of dollars, I'm pretty sure people would try. Whether or not it would go to court, whether or not it would succeed, people would try. And this now brings me to why Wizards of the Coast never will. It's because of risk. If we look at Investopedia, which was the first definition I could find, I'm sorry, what a shit source to cite, but what is risk from a business or financial perspective? Well, risk is defined in financial terms as the chance that an outcome or investment's actual gains will differ from an expected outcome or return. Risk includes the possibility of losing some or all of an original investment. We are all aware of the concept of risk as Magic the Gathering players. Sometimes you will keep a risky opening hand thinking, well, this one card in my opening hand is good, it's a bit slow, but the risk might get paid off, maybe I'll be rewarded, maybe I'll never get punished. We've also seen it with things like playing a deck that you know is not positioned well in the metagame. It's a risk, but let's fucking go for it. Or the most common one, I guess, is making your opponent have it. There's a chance that that last card in hand is a removal spell or a counter spell because things are just lining up that way. But you can't play Magic always playing around everything. So sometimes you've got to make them have it. We're all aware of risk. However, outside of Magic the Gathering and gaming, I say outside, it kind of has parallels, but the opposite side or the connected thing to risk is return. Or in the case of Investopedia said, like, what you're going to get back from the investment. To break it down even further, is the risk of dismantling the reserve list, of reprinting cards on the reserve list, is that going to give you enough of a return to offset said risk? Let's say that, and I don't even know if, I'm kind of think I'm on the camp where I don't think people will actually get through a court with this shit, but but I'm not a lawyer, and and that's more of a gut feeling than actually like a rational thing, but let's say, we even said there's only a 10% chance. A 10% chance that it goes to court, gets through courts, and Wizards get fully successfully sued for the damages to people's collections and investments. It doesn't feel big for you and I. Would you take a 10% risk? But if that 10% risk is like millions or billions of dollars of damages, you might not want to do that as a big company. And what's the upside? What's the payoff for said risk? They can reprint some dual lands and some power, which they're probably sparingly anyway. Sure, that would probably drive sales pretty well, and imagine that'd be a big boom for the company. But the company's already reporting record sales every single quarter. It's already bringing in new players via Arena and Digital. It's already flirting playfully with reprint equity and fucking about with the staples of other Eternal formats like Modern with fetch lands and shit like that. They're already doing this without any of the risk that exists in this reserve list, lawful, promissory estoppel ganger nonsense. Why would they take that risk? They already sell the cards, they already mangle the distribution and reprinting of other staples that aren't on said list and therefore don't have said risk. What do they get by going back and reprinting dual lands or Power 9 or whatever? Very little compared to the potential risk of what they could lose. Now, I'm saying they will never do it and this is the reason. It's simply because the risk does not outweigh the reward. That is under current circumstances. Of course, if Wizards of the Coast started doing very badly, if Magic the Gathering started to downward spiral into an unprofitable hole and Hasbro were strapped for cash, perhaps they would take said risk. They would go with it and see what happens in order to pull people back to the game by reprinting Black Lotuses and Ancestral Recalls and dual lands and such. But that said, if Hasbro was doing okay and Wizards wasn't, or the game wasn't, they might just ride out the storm, but because again, the game becoming not as profitable as it is now may still not be enough of an incentive to take the risk of potentially millions of dollars of damage from fucking tanking the price of these cards if they would tank. Again, it's just a risk. It's not a set factual thing, it's just a risk. So it simply doesn't matter how much people like myself want the older formats to be accessible. It doesn't matter how much people at Wizards of the Coast want older formats to be accessible. I have had the opportunity and the privilege, I guess, of sitting with a couple of Wizards employees in the past at events and playing Legacy with one or two of them. I won't name any names for fear of embarrassment and things like that, but they have talked to me and we've spoken about how much we love older formats and we love old frames and we love old cards. And I think it comes from a really wholesome, genuine place that these people love Magic in all its forms, including these older formats. But those things don't matter because it's to do with the risk of a global corporate entity like Hasbro. It's nothing to do with what Rosewater or anyone else at the company wants. Also, it wasn't Rosewater. I've never played Legacy with Rosewater. It all boils down to an appetite for risk that doesn't allow for the risk of damaging or undoing the reserve list, because the benefit just isn't there. To me, keeping Legacy alive is a huge benefit, but I'm not that company, and also would I take millions or billions of dollars worth of risk? No, because at the moment, they don't really give a fuck. It doesn't matter. Magic's still booming. Arena's booming. Cards are still selling. Even during a global health crisis. Even during a fucking pandemic, Magic cards are still selling. So there's no reason for them to tread over that old ground that's dangerous, to go through that legal minefield. There's just no reason for them to do it. It's too risky, even if the risk is relatively small. It's just not worth it. So the reserve list is here to stay because of risk. That's my take on it. Is it all doom and gloom? Is it all negative? Does it mean that Legacy will eventually die? Probably. I guess, again, as Saf and Oliver said in a recent MTG Goldfish article, links in the description below, that they could change the reserve list. They could adjust or pivot on the promise a little bit. They have done in the past. As many people have gone through, as Brian went through in his video, they have changed. They have printed Demonic Tutor when they shouldn't have, or taken off the list, should I say. They have printed Wheel of Fortune at the Judge promo, and so on and so on. Foils skirt the reserve list. So we could see more of that in future if they really, really needed to, and that would present much, much lower risk because they're still working within the original framework, not breaching it in a way that might open them up to this promissory escalop thing. So maybe that's what we'll see. We'll see that long before we see the death of the reserve list, which I really think will never happen. I've been Vince, also known as PleasantKenobi on the internet. Be good to one another, and there'll be some more Magic gameplay later this week. So yeah, keep playing Legacy while you still can. Seize the day, cunts!